Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We got a big audience moving into the room, so to speak, for today's program. So I'm going to let a couple more in and then begin. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kelley Vlahos, and I am the editorial director of the Quincy Institute's foreign policy magazine, Responsible Statecraft. I am honored today to be moderating this important panel, Does Peace Have a Chance in Ukraine? I think you will all agree that this is much more than a tongue-in-cheek question with a John Lennon twist. After deteriorating conditions on the ground for Ukraine in the first half of 2024, this is the most serious query of the day. How long can Ukraine hold out militarily and economically? And is it in the best position right now to start negotiating? Or, as others in Washington have proposed, does Ukraine have to get into a better battlefield position before it can think about talking? What about Russia? Despite the Kremlin's declarations about being ready to talk, what incentive do they have right now to go there? And is the US, in coordination with other Western countries, ready to start encouraging Kyiv and Moscow in this direction, or are they holding out for some perceived turnaround on the battlefield? We have an all-star panel today that is well equipped to shed light on these important questions, albeit with varying opinions on where we are now and whether negotiations are even a realistic prospect. So before we get into that, which I hope to be a rich 55-minute discussion with a chance for audience Q&A, let me formally introduce the panel. Liana Fix is a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is a historian and political scientist with expertise in German and European foreign and security policy, European security, transatlantic relations, Russia, Eastern Europe. She is also the author of A New German Power, Germany's Role in European Russian Policy. That was published in 2021. Dr. Fix's work focuses on German domestic and foreign policy, the European Union, transatlantic relations, and Europe's relations with Russia and China. Samuel Charap is the Distinguished Chair in Russia and Eurasia Policy at the RAND Corporation. His research interests include the foreign policies of Russia and the former Soviet states, European and Eurasian regional security, and U.S.-Russia deterrence, strategic stability, and arms control. From November 2012 to April 2017, Charap was the senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. George Beebe, last but not least, is my colleague and director of the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute. He spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including director of the CIA's Russia analysis and staff advisor on Russia matters to Vice President Dick Cheney. His book, The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe, published in 2019, warned how the US and Russia could stumble into a dangerous military confrontation. So I'd love to welcome our esteemed panelists to the discussion today. I'm really looking forward to this. And just as a reminder to our audience, if you have questions for the program today, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And I'm going to try to get to as many as I can as they fit into the discussion we're having, which will close out in a little less than an hour. So George, I'd like to start with you to sort of set the table, if you will. Can you talk a bit about what the battlefield conditions look like today on the ground in Ukraine, whether they have improved for Ukraine since the first of the year, and most importantly, whether you think the infusion of new aid that was just passed by Congress, expected to be signed by the president today, will change anything, change the conditions and trajectory of the war?
Well, thanks, Kelley. I think we could spend the entire panel talking just about battlefield conditions and trends that we're seeing right now. But I'll briefly summarize this by saying that Momentum in the war right now is on Russia's side. The Russians have corrected many of the problems that beset their approach to the war earlier after the invasion. They've succeeded in turning this into a war of attrition. I think that's one that maximizes the advantages that Russia has in population and sheer military manufacturing wherewithal, and is aimed at over time exhausting Ukraine's reserves of men and weapons and exhausting the West's patience for continuing to support Ukraine. The Russians have not made an enormous effort to take a lot of territory on the map. We haven't seen big changes in the front lines over the last more than a year, actually. But Russia has succeeded in making significant advances in exhausting Ukraine's manpower, using up its supplies of air defense missiles, and taking advantage of its greater stores of artillery ammunition and manufacturing capability. The question really now is, will the momentum continue to stay on Russia's side? Or can this new aid package buy some time for Ukraine and for the West to regroup, to hold off Russian advances while Ukraine builds up its manpower again, and the West ramps up its military manufacturing capability so that Ukraine can take another go at the Russians on the offensive sometime in 2025 or beyond? And that's really an unknown question. And we also don't know what the Russians are going to do in the interim. Are they going to continue to focus on this slow war of attrition, or will they launch some sort of big aero offensive in an effort to break through Ukrainian lines and wrap this war up more quickly before the West can really ramp up its own support for the Ukrainians? Those are big unknowns right now.
And the aid specifically, do you see that in the short term, giving Ukraine the shot in the arm, so to speak, that it needs to change the momentum?
Well, I'm not sure that the aid in the volumes that we're talking about and the time frames within which it's likely to be provided is going to make a dramatic difference in Ukraine's fortunes. Can it slow Russia's momentum? Possibly. Can it lead to victory? Certainly not anytime soon. And it's a big unknown whether it will buy enough of a breathing spell that Ukraine can take another run at driving the Russians back sometime in the future. The other big unknown is, can the West sustain this kind of aid for a long time to come? $61 billion, of which $14 billion is for new procurement of weapons for Ukraine, doesn't take you very far down the road. There are going to have to be many more large infusions of aid to the Ukrainians for a long time to come for that sort of hold and rebuild strategy to work. And frankly, the controversies that we saw in Congress over this package and the trends that you're seeing in American public opinion over time suggest to me that the viability of large, long-term largesse from the West to Ukraine is very much in question.
Thank you. Liana, I know last year you had published an article for Foreign Affairs with Michael Kimmage, in which you said the Ukrainians should accept and prepare for a multi-year war and a long-term commitment of Russia, instead of hoping for either a quick Ukrainian triumph or, absent that, an imminent negotiated solution. Can you talk a little bit about that aid that was passed last night and is expected to be signed by the president today? Do you think that will help in this long struggle? And what do you think about George's assessment of the battlefield conditions today? Are they as dire, or do you see an opening for Ukraine with this aid? And in the long term. Oh, I think you're on mute. Yeah.
So
There you
now
go.
it should work. So the aid that has just been passed in Congress is obviously absolutely essential. I mean, there's just no way around the United States continuing its military commitment to Ukraine, because Europeans need to build up their own defense industry to be able in any way to replace the kind of military commitment that the United States makes to Ukraine. And they are not there at that point. So what the Europeans are doing is they do support militarily, but primarily financially. But the US military commitment here is absolutely essential. It is also essential because the lack of Western support and the dying down of ammunition supplies to Ukraine were one of the main reasons for Russia's slow advance in Ukraine in the last weeks and months. Of course, Ukraine also has mobilization problems. It has just passed a new law to reform mobilization in Ukraine. They need additional manpower, but with this package, there's definitely a very real chance for Ukraine not only to solidify those lines, but also to solidify its manpower problem this year, and to have the potential to go on the offensive last year. I think we do have to move away from this idea that there will be one big victory either for Russia or for Ukraine, as Michael Kimmich and I argued. The battlefield victory is not necessarily the framework that is really helpful to think about this war. We need to think about what does victory mean in political terms for Ukraine. And in political terms, it means that Ukraine will have a future in the West, both in the European Union and in NATO. And that is a future outcome which can and probably will at some point be part of negotiations with Russia. But to have these negotiations on Ukrainian terms, the military aid will be necessary not only for this year, but probably for the next year and the year after. Why can't we expect any Russian concessions this year? It's obviously because of the US presidential elections. There's just no way from Moscow's perspective why it would make sense to make any concessions, even if the aid package has passed, and we see quite a furious response from Moscow to the passing of the aid package. So it does hurt that this aid package is going to Ukraine. But it is very unlikely that there will be any willingness on the Russia side to move before the US elections. And so far, the question, who does peace have a chance in Ukraine, also invites the question, who does or who does not give peace a chance in Ukraine. And the Kremlin has tried to advance a narrative that it is the West that does not want peace in Ukraine, that has pushed Ukraine into abandoning negotiations. Sam has written in more detail about the Istanbul talks. But this is a narrative which is obviously tries to camouflage Russia's real interests, which have not changed since the beginning of the war, to get Ukraine under its political control and to define the future of Ukraine as part of Russia. And if we take these Russian interests as the baseline that has not changed, then it is very difficult to imagine how this war can end in the near term, because the West has leverage to force Ukraine to a lot of things, because Ukraine is so dependent on Western support. But the West does not have a lot of leverage to force Russia into compliance with anything. And this leverage can only be created through military strength or through economic sanctions. That would be the other option, through economic sanctions, for instance, on Russian oil. But apart from that, we've seen in the past that getting Russia to an agreement that it actually complies with, it's incredibly difficult. And that is why I do see the course of the war continuing along the path that we see now for at least this year, probably next year too.
Okay, I think we're going to get more into that later, because I'm sure particularly George probably has a little bit of disagreement with that. But I wanted to go on to Sam, because Liana, you brought up the Istanbul talks and Sam's recent article that just really hit like a bomb in Washington. He co-bylined it with Sergei Radchenko. It was in Foreign Affairs, entitled "The Talks That Could Have Ended the War." The article gives more detail to the 2022 talks between Russia and Ukraine than we've ever seen before. So kudos, Sam, for that fantastic reporting. In that article, you write, a final reason the talks failed at that time is that the negotiators put the cart of a post-war security order before the horse of ending the war. The two sides skipped over essential matters of conflict management and migration, the creation of humanitarian corridors, a ceasefire, troop withdrawals, and instead tried to craft something like a long-term peace treaty that would resolve security disputes that had been the source of geopolitical tensions for decades. It was an admirably ambitious effort, but it proved too ambitious. To be fair, Russia, Ukraine, and the West had tried it the other way around in the Minsk Agreement signed in 2024, following Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass, covered minutiae, and it did cover minutiae just as the date and time of the cessation of hostilities and which weapon systems should be withdrawn at what distance. Both sides' core security concerns were addressed indirectly, if at all. You say the history suggests that future talks should move forward on parallel tracks, with the practicalities of ending the war being addressed on one track while broader issues are covered in another. So a lot to unpack there, especially in against the backdrop of what Liana was just raising. I think our audience, first and foremost, would love to hear whether you think that scenario of talks running on parallel tracks would work today, and maybe you could give us a little context of how you perceive these parallel tracks and why the 2022 setup didn't work because it was absent those parallel tracks.
Thanks, Kelley. I think if we take as a premise that this conflict, this war, is at least in part, it's useful to think about it as a nested one. In other words, there are multiple levels of conflict here. Clearly, there's the most direct conflict in the two belligerents, the Russia-Ukraine level, but there are broader issues at stake, and a broader Russia-West dynamic and a broader European security dynamic that is layered on top of that purely bilateral Russia-Ukraine conflict. And in that context, looking back on the Istanbul talks, which ended up focusing on the content of a potential treaty on Ukraine's permanent neutrality and security guarantees, we, without addressing any of the sort of practicalities of the ending of the war, it seemed in retrospect that, it was a lot to go from being in the midst of a brutal conflict where you had Russian forces, not too far from the outskirts of Kyiv, to a, big sort of set of political arrangements that would have addressed these thorny issues that had been dividing, not only Russia and Ukraine, but Russia and the West more broadly for decades, really, without any of these sort of interim steps. Now, as you mentioned, we referenced the Minsk agreements from 2014 and 2015, which sort of had the opposite problem, that they were very focused on the minutiae of conflict management and not on the broader disputes. And I think we now have a record that suggests that exclusively focusing on one level and not on the other, we have a good reason to suspect that it won't lead very far. So just the idea that in the future, we're likely to succeed if these issues are addressed in parallel, that both are, will be extremely important to any endgame, and that therefore there's likely to need to be a sort of broader dialogue involving both Russia, Ukraine, and other players in European security as Russia and Ukraine deal with the sort of concrete issues of ceasefire modalities and so on when the time comes.
Sam, I'm gonna break my little protocol here and ask you a question from the audience while we're on this topic of the Istanbul talks. There is a viewer by the name of Almut Rachawansky. I'm sorry if I butchered your name, Almut. He wants to know that when you talk to Ukrainian and Western sources about those talks, did any of them express regret at abandoning or ignoring, respectively, a deal that would have been far better than what Ukraine might get in the future? More importantly, did any of them say that if and when another such opportunity comes, they won't show a cold shoulder again and instead do what they can to make it succeed? Like, what did you get in terms of like the vibe from the sources you talked to, their feelings about what happened and their projections of what might happen in the future?
So I think it's fair to say that as a general matter, and I'm going to speak elliptically here because I don't want to, we spoke to all of the sources that we spoke to on the basis of anonymity, but the people directly involved in an event like this are likely to be those who are most invested in having seen it through to a successful outcome. So I think that naturally, some of the people who are directly involved do have a sense of not exactly regret, but they thought it was close, and some of them at least, and had hoped that it had turned out differently. We didn't really broach the subject of in our conversations with those current and former Western officials who were dealing with it at the time about whether and how they would react differently this time around. One of the things we tried to do in that piece, and I hope this came through, was while we did derive some lessons for the present, I think regardless of what you think about where we are today in the war or what prospects there are for future negotiations, clearly the circumstances have dramatically changed or significantly changed since the spring of 22, the first weeks of the war. But getting history right, really understanding what happened and why is important, really, no matter what, no matter how things proceed going forward. So we tried to divorce the sort of trying to establish a better understanding of that past, now 2 years ago, history with projections for the future.
Just
Thank you.
pick up quickly on what
Sure.
Sam's saying. I think there are reasons to believe that Ukraine will be able to have a better deal than it had back then, and that's what Sam said. We were very much in the beginning of the first weeks of the war, where Ukraine sort of barely managed to keep the line, to defend Kiev, and to drive Russian forces back. Since then, we had the full year of 2022, and we have seen quite significant Ukrainian advances in the liberation of territory, of major parts of territory, that would there have been a deal in April would have been under Russian occupation. And we all know how Russian occupation looks like in those territories, right? So at least sort of from a very human perspective, those people who live on these territories that have been liberated in 2022 by Ukraine certainly have a better future now than under Russian occupation. And I think the other question that to some extent the article by Sam and by Sergei Radchenko leaves unanswered, and perhaps difficult to answer, is really how much backing the negotiations back then really had from Vladimir Putin. I mean, the Minsk negotiations were sort of directly with direct backing from Putin. It was very clear that this was on the highest level. It is less clear how much support this delegation actually had, especially the Russian delegation leader. So that is something I think which we should also keep in mind, that these negotiations back in April, that this is a question which we cannot answer in hindsight. If there would have been a deal, if that is actually something that Putin would have wanted, and curious to hear what Sam has to say to that, or if that was just something that Russian negotiators pursued for other reasons, to gain time, to see what at the moment they can get out of Ukraine. And I think the assumption that Russia went in these talks with full seriousness, that Vladimir Putin would accept any outcome, is at least questionable. And again, I do think with continuous military support, the liberation of major parts of Ukrainian territory, and the continuation of Western support, there will be in the future a better deal to have for Ukraine.
Well, so if I may on that question, I mean, at the end of the day, the Putin seriousness was never tested because the talks broke off without the agreement being finalized. So to say that we know for sure one way or the other would be basically conjecture. As far as obviously the Russian delegation leader has kind of a notorious reputation because of some of the things he's been associated with. That is certainly true, but he does have the same ranking as Putin's foreign policy advisor in the Russian system, right? He's not. We have to also think about what we heard directly from the Ukrainian negotiators, which was they did not have the view that that their Russian counterparts were disempowered. For what it's worth, but of course, I don't exclude that either side was using this at least in part as a means of buying time. That's I think we're none of us are inside of the heads of the people ultimately making those decisions, and we only have the evidence that we can go on. But there is a lot of evidence to suggest that at least during the time when these were ongoing, there was some quite high level political engagement. As for whether Ukraine could get a better deal now than what it could have gotten back then, I mean, I think we shouldn't assigning normative values to that is difficult. It will be a different arrangement, and while there will be potentially less area under Russian occupation, there will be a whole lot more dead Ukrainians, and there are a lot of Ukrainians who have been killed in the intervening 2 years. So, I mean, we're not dealing with easy options where you've got like one set of arrangements that could be reached now that would have a universally humanitarian higher value than those that could have been reached then. There are trade-offs here. And to suggest that there haven't been any humanitarian losses, I think, in the last 2 years, to go along with the humanitarian gains of less area of Ukraine being under Russian occupation would also not be doing justice to everything that's occurred.
George?
Yeah, just a comment on this question of can Ukraine get a better deal? I think the answer is clearly no. Ukraine's leverage in any negotiation, should they agree to enter into a negotiation, which is still an uncertainty, is diminishing over time. Why? Not because it's losing a lot more territory. It's not, at least not yet. But it is losing men, and it can ill afford to do that. Ukraine has now got, if not the lowest birth rate in the world, then certainly one of them. It is in a demographic crisis that is going to get worse the longer this war goes on. Its prospects for rebuilding its infrastructure and resurrecting its economy are diminishing by the day for as long as this war continues. Ukraine is not going to have a vibrant economy if it does not get refugees returning to Ukraine in large numbers. Many of them fled to Russia. They're not going to go back to Ukraine. The bulk went to Europe, but they're not going to go back to Ukraine in large numbers if they don't believe there are going to be jobs and security awaiting them there. And the Russians have, I'm sorry to say, a major voice on whether Ukraine gets reconstructed or not. Because, I doubt that Russia can take Kiev. I doubt that it can or even wants to conquer the bulk of Ukrainian territory, because trying to govern and pacify it would be an enormous problem, and the Russians are smart enough to recognize that. But they can keep Ukraine in a state of dysfunction for a long time to come if they believe that that's the only lever they have to keep Ukraine out of NATO or out of some sort of bilateral military alliance with the United States. And I'm quite convinced that they will do that. And that means that Ukraine is going to suffer increasingly over time for as long as we don't have a compromise deal that we're working toward.
George, to follow up on that, I'd like you to respond to what Liana said about her misgivings or her lack of confidence that Russia really wants to engage in negotiations. And we have a question in the Q&A from Jaroslaw Martiniuk. I'm sorry again if I'm mispronouncing that, but he says, based on the history, to what extent can you trust Putin and Russia to even stick to any agreement that may be reached? I think that's a major question that I hear echoed throughout Washington. A, do they really want to talk, or is it a bluff? B, can they stick to any agreement that they make? Can you talk a little bit about that, like how you feel about that?
Well, and the question of as to whether they really want to talk or not, I agree with Sam on this. At this point, we haven't tested it. The Russians say they want to talk, but you don't really know until you say, okay, let's sit down and talk. And then they've either got to follow through or admit they were bluffing. So I think it's in our interest actually to test their willingness to talk, number one. Number two, on the question of can we trust them to adhere to any deal, it's a good question to ask, but I would argue that you don't simply trust the Russians out of the goodness of their hearts to adhere to any agreement because that's what gentlemanly states do. I think what we have to do is set up a situation where the Russians see it as in their interest to uphold the terms of whatever compromise is reached. The Ukrainians do it as well for their own reasons, and so does the United States and the rest of its Western allies. You want a point in the negotiations where the Venn diagram overlaps enough that all of these states see it as in their self-interest to adhere to the deal. But you don't just leave it at that. You also have mechanisms for monitoring and verifying compliance with the terms. And we've done this before. We have a history throughout the Cold War and even after the Cold War of putting together arms control deals and various other kinds of state-to-state arrangements that include monitoring and compliance elements. We know how to do this. You don't just trust, as Ronald Reagan used to say, and as the Russians themselves say, you trust but verify. And I think that's the approach we would have to take in Ukraine.
Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit. This is something that Liana had raised in her last comment, but George, you actually raised this somewhat obliquely, but straightforwardly in your recent brief for the Quincy Institute with Anatol Lieven entitled The Diplomatic Path to Secure Ukraine. I recommend it to everybody who's on this call today. But you mentioned the US elections, and you say the Biden administration, for its part, is trying to sustain the Ukrainian defense and what has become a war of attrition while deferring any serious talk of negotiations. The hope is that this strategy can succeed until at least after the US elections, when it is likely either Joe Biden will be reconfirmed in office and be in a stronger domestic position to negotiate with Putin, or Ukraine will be Donald Trump's problem. And Liana raised the issue of the elections as well. I want to ask all three of you, how important are the November elections to the Biden policy on Ukraine today? Is Biden buying time? Is he playing a dangerous game in which things could really fall apart before November, which would really hurt his election chances? I know this sounds awful because this should be all about the Ukrainian people who are dying and suffering there, but this is Washington, and there are political considerations here. Can each of you talk about what role the elections are playing in all of this? George, do you want to start?
Well, yeah, no, I do think that the Biden administration is playing a holding game. They're providing the Ukrainians with what they see as enough defensive capability to stave off a collapse between now and the end of this year. At which point, either the White House will have a little bit more domestic political flexibility to consider some sort of diplomatic approach to all this, or it will be some Republican administration's problem. Do I think that's dangerous? I do. I think the chances of a Ukrainian collapse are somewhat diminished as a result of the aid that's going to be coming their way, but not entirely eliminated. I think the Ukrainians are indeed in a precarious situation. the Russians do have some formidable obstacles. Taking the big cities, for example, will be slow and very bloody if the Russians have to mount a direct assault and engage in house-to-house urban combat. They'd rather not do that. I think they'd rather just wear the Ukrainians down to the point where they collapse, and then you demand control of those cities in some sort of negotiation thereafter. But would the Russians consider talking to the Biden administration prior to the election? I think we have probably mistakenly ruled out the possibility that Russia would engage with Biden now. Why do they have an incentive to? Well, part of it's the devil you know problem, right? They certainly believe that Biden is, quite hostile toward Russia, but they also think he's in control of his own government and can deliver on whatever deal might be struck. I don't think they have that kind of confidence in Trump. I think they see him as more erratic, more unpredictable. The first 4 years of his presidency certainly did not give the Russians confidence that he could deliver his own government to uphold any kind of deal that he might strike with the Russians. And so, Putin himself, in his infamous interview with Tucker Carlson, said he'd rather deal with Biden. And from some of the Russians that I talked to, that's not entirely spin. There is indeed a perception in Moscow that they'd rather deal with a hostile but stable and predictable Biden White House on this.
Liana, I see you smiling over there.
Yeah, I just don't think that if Putin says to Tucker Carlson that he prefers Biden, that this is something that I would believe face value. I think there's much reason to believe that Vladimir Putin wants to prevent the impression that that Trump is a Russia candidate and therefore tries everything to deflect from the obvious preference and the obvious sympathies that Donald Trump has for Russia, and also from the very obvious disdain that Donald Trump has from Ukraine. And I'm much less optimistic there. For Donald Trump, Ukraine is linked to his own history of having investigations in the United States, losing the presidency. He has no interest in Ukraine whatsoever. He has a very difficult relationship with Volodymyr Zelensky. So there are a lot of reasons to believe that Donald Trump would try a deal over Ukraine with Putin, which would be everything but on Ukrainian terms. I wanted to go back on 2 points because I think these are important. And again, on one side, I'm more optimistic, and on one side, less optimistic. I do agree that an outcome of the war needs to align with a situation where Russian interests are met, but also sort of where it is in Russia's interest to end the war, but also where we need mechanisms. But I'm unfortunately much less optimistic. Just because arms control mechanisms on strategic stability have worked in the Cold War, that cannot be easily transferred to a conflict mechanism. And if you look at conflicts in the post-Soviet space, if you want to call it this way, after 1990, there has been no conflict where Russia has complied with agreements that have been struck. And it has started in Georgia, where there was a EU monitoring mission that is supposed to monitor both lines. Russia has agreed to that under President Medvedev, not under Vladimir Putin, but does not let the monitoring mission monitor the Russian controlled side. The same with the Minsk agreements, major non-compliances. So I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is how to make it in Russia's interest and how to make them comply. And there, it does not only need incentives, it does need sticks. And these sticks need to come through military strength and through Russian fears that they might otherwise lose the war if they don't start negotiating. If we don't have this as a stick, but just believe that we somehow magically will come to a point where Russia has an interest in ending the war and where they will comply with mechanisms, I think that the history tells us in these conflicts in the last years that this is much less the case. And I mean, from Ukraine's perspective, if we look at the question of are there trade-offs, humanitarian trade-offs between continuing the war and having an earlier deal, I think Ukrainians have made their choice. And in the end, it is their choice and it is their agency. And they have made their choice that a compromise deal from their perspective, and that's what all opinion polls still say, is not something that they believe in. It's something that they felt has not worked in 2014, and they don't want to try again, for fear that a compromise deal which cannot be upheld will lead to another war in a couple of years down the line. And I think that's also a choice that we have to respect in terms of agency. One last point about the question: would Putin be willing to negotiate before the elections? I think that is something, if you look at the statements that are coming out from Moscow in the run-up to the elections and also on the negotiations, there are many statements that very clearly state it is not in Russia's interest. Why should Russia negotiate if Donald Trump can come into the White House in November? That's something which is discussed in Russian talk shows. I think this idea that Donald Trump might be more unpredictable is fair. He is certainly unpredictable and follows his gut instincts in a way which make it difficult to have coherent policy choices. But then on the other hand, one of his gut instincts is that he wants to strike a deal with Vladimir Putin, and that he really has no interest in Ukraine or in upholding Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, and questions the security of Europe with his threat if Europeans do not spend 2%. So I think if these are the gut instincts of Donald Trump that we can rely on, then we can end up in a negotiation situation with Donald Trump as a president, which is dangerous not only for Ukraine, but also for the Europeans.
Sam, do you want to follow up on the election commission question, or anything that Liana just said about what Ukraine might be willing or not willing to do in terms of compromise and a negotiated settlement? Any of that, or I can move on and ask another question?
Sure. Well, just briefly, you know, I think there's a lot of logic to the assumptions we're making about or Liana's making about Russian unwillingness to engage, given the prospect of a potential Trump victory. But the bottom line is that, you know, ultimately this is all speculative until someone tests the proposition. So we can say it's unlikely that they will agree, but, you know, that's just it becomes a sort of analytical exercise divorced from reality if no one's actually trying and seeing it fail. So I think that those are we need to separate, I think, the two. There are good reasons maybe to be skeptical about that, but, you know, until there is an attempt, it's ultimately speculative. And I would just also, I guess, differentiate between the question of assessing humanitarian impact and the question of Ukrainian agency, which do seem to me to be two separate questions. If we're asking the question about whether there has been, you know, an objective humanitarian cost to the last 2 years of war, that's something we can judge, you know, without reference to the question of whether Ukraine should have done X, Y, or Z. Ultimately, that's up to them. But there are, of course, consequences and costs, and that's something as analysts that we should be keeping in mind.
Okay, we have a ton of questions, and I'm going to try to dovetail a few of them. Nan Swift asked, when panelists talk about negotiations, can we be a little bit more concrete about what that would entail specifically? John Mueller from Cato has asked, does it make sense to concentrate almost entirely on getting a ceasefire in place and then worry about the rest later, perhaps much later? And then there are a few questions in the queue and in my mind about the issue of neutrality and whether or not it's true that both sides were more amenable than we have given it credit to Ukraine accepting neutrality to move forward in a peace agreement. So can you, maybe all three of you want to touch on those questions as they relate to each other, but also relate to the bigger picture of what would negotiations actually look like? George, I see you with your finger all over. Yeah.
Well, on this question of should we just focus on ceasefire, I think that's unrealistic. I don't think the Russians are going to agree to a ceasefire under current conditions. They believe that momentum is on their side. Why should they arrest that momentum in pursuit of something that may well be quixotic from their point of view, some sort of bigger strategic deal with the United States and Europe over Ukraine's neutrality and the broader European security structure? I think that Sam is correct. This is a nested conflict, and we can't exclusively focus on top-down, big strategic issues and hope that the minutia of, specific disengagement and that sort of thing will flow from that. Nor can we start from the bottom up and say, let's just agree to stop shooting each other and then we'll start tackling the bigger strategic issues. We're going to have to do both at the same time in parallel. And there is, in my mind, absolutely no question that there will not be an end to the fighting if there is not an understanding on Ukraine's neutrality. That is a fundamental prerequisite. It's been true since the origins of this conflict, which well predate February 2022. And it was certainly a prominent aspect of the Istanbul talks, as Sam pointed out in his Foreign Affairs article.
Liana?
I think neutrality is dead, honestly. And the reason for that is that with Russian leadership that pursues Russian foreign policy in the way it pursues it now as an imperialistic project, there is no space for real neutrality that we would accept as a country, being able to choose between different partners and not coming under pressure from Russia, not only political and economic pressure, and we've seen that in Ukraine play out since the 1990s, but also under military pressure and military intervention to remain in Russia. Sphere of influence is too mild in this case. And we do see that countries that have traditionally, and Finland would never call itself neutral, but which have not been aligned in an alliance, like Finland and Sweden, believe that the change in Russian foreign policy towards a more imperialistic foreign policy is dangerous. And that's why being part of an alliance or not being part of an alliance is so crucial. It's in the end also crucial for the question of Ukraine's future. And by that, I mean NATO membership, which is certainly a distant perspective now that the war is still ongoing because of Article 5 and other member states being drawn in. But certainly a ceasefire would be sort of stabilized lines, front lines, would be something that one would need to even think about NATO membership or a NATO model that follows, for example, the German East-West model. So I don't believe that neutrality being on Russia's border with the current Russian regime is possible at all. I think the main question here in terms of negotiation is sort of, is there harm in trying or is there no harm in trying? And I think that's perhaps where Sam and I disagree. I do think there's value in trying when the conditions are right for trying it, but I do think there can be harm in trying when the conditions are not right, because trying sends signals of willingness to make concessions. It can lead to a situation where you have to accept preconditions from the Russian side, and it can lead into a situation where Russia drags you into a negotiation process where you have not enough leverage to force Russia into certain positions. And that leverage can, again, only come through military power and military strength, or it can come through an increase of economic sanctions. These kinds of sticks are needed to get any negotiation right. And without these sticks being in place before you enter negotiations, I do think there can be harm in trying.
George, is that a two finger that you're putting up there?
Just a two finger on this, because in principle, I agree with Liana that you need leverage in a negotiation. You need both carrots and sticks. You need incentives, and you also need coercive tools. Where I disagree with her is her belief that the only type of stick that we can use, the only leverage that we have with the Russians, is military. Or economic sanctions, coercion. They are a necessary ingredient in a negotiating strategy, but they're not the only form of leverage that we have. And if we exclusively focus on military leverage in attempting to steer this conflict toward an acceptable end, we're going to be in trouble. Because right now, the Russians, I believe, have the military advantage, and they're likely to continue to have that advantage over the long term. So, if you're saying, well, the only way we can negotiate or be successful or reach a deal is if we have the upper hand on the battlefield over the Russians, we're going to be in for a very sobering, I think, and tragic outcome in Ukraine, in which the Ukrainians themselves are condemned to state failure, essentially, over time. And that's not a good situation for anybody, but particularly not for the Ukrainians.
Sam, is neutrality dead, like Liana has suggested?
Well, if it is to be alive or dead, it's that is a choice for the Ukrainian leadership to make, and it did in the spring of 2022, as we describe in the article, make one set of decisions about this issue where they embraced the possibility of permanent neutrality via UN Security Council resolution, following the Russian annexation of four Ukrainian regions in the fall of 2022. President Zelensky changed his position on that and has pursued a much more accelerated integration with NATO in the meantime. I think, though, so if there is to be a return to the previous policy, that's up to the Ukrainian leadership to decide. It's not really for others. But regardless of what Ukraine decides, there are some limitations here, and that is the reality that the war will end, and Ukraine, regardless of its aspirations, will be de facto non-aligned, right? Like the prospect of it actually joining the alliance before the war is over are non-realistic, right? And so the question is whether the prospect of eventual membership is more of a security benefit for Ukraine, or poses more security risks for Ukraine. And I think we should perhaps remain agnostic about that. There are good reasons to suspect it will potentially be, at least there's evidence that it could go either way. We have a long track record of Russian views on this set of issues, and a potential reason to suspect that they might keep on fighting if that prospect were to remain on the table, as George suggests. But things might change over time. So I think that we need
just with a clarification, Sam, the permanent neutrality, if I remember it correctly, was sort of in exchange for credible Western security guarantees, which would be sort of more than Budapest, which the West was sort of not able or willing at that point to give, right? So it's like neutrality, which someone would have to make sure remains a real neutrality, which would be sort of the precondition to that, if I'm not mistaken, right? That
was what was talked about in Istanbul, but regardless, even before the war, as late as I can recall the Zelensky speech in Munich a couple of weeks before the full-scale invasion, when he put that question on the table as well. So I think that it is clear that the question of alignment was viewed differently in the spring of 2022 than it was from fall and onwards. But the point I'm making is more, I do think that is Ukrainian policy changed. The question is, could it change back? I don't know the answer to that. But regardless of whether it changes, right, it will end the war in all likelihood, de facto non-aligned, that is not a member of an alliance. The question is whether the prospect of eventual membership serves to its security benefit or detriment. And there, I think that there are arguments on both sides. And I think that discussion is one that will have to come in the context of actually moving towards that outcome. I think that the challenge with where we are today in terms of negotiations, both at the Russia West level and at the Russia Ukraine level, although if Reuters is to be believed, the Russians and the Ukrainians were in fact talking about specific arrangements in this context of Black Sea, the security of Black Sea civilian shipping as late as like last month. In any case, they don't really acknowledge publicly the fact that they are or were talking. They certainly have been talking about POW exchanges and so on. But that is not true on the Russia West level, is that we should never have stopped talking. And as a result, and that doesn't mean a formal negotiations with like flags on a table and so on, but keeping channels of communication open throughout this conflict would have been, I think, in the interests of both Ukraine and the West, and that as a result, returning to keeping those channels open and publicly acknowledging, at least in the Ukrainian case, that they are in fact talking, is going to be viewed as a concession. But it should not be. In fact, these are ways of pursuing your interests, not by any means a concession in themselves. And as far as leverage is concerned, you don't really know how much leverage you have in a negotiation until you're actually at the table. In the meantime, it's just sort of virtual. Leverage is something where pressure is converted into results through a bargaining process by definition. I don't know exactly what could be accomplished if the leverage that currently exists were exercised. Right now, it's not being exercised because the only way you can do that is through a negotiation, some bargaining process.
George, you seem to have a two-finger up earlier, but has that moment passed, or?
Well, I would simply say that the point that it's up to Ukraine to decide whether it wants to be neutral or not, while true in principle, is insufficient to describe the situation. Ukraine can continue to maintain that its future lies in the NATO alliance, but the NATO alliance and its members have a say in that, including the United States. Right now, we're in a paradoxical situation where the United States has told the Ukrainians, well, you're not going to be in NATO anytime soon, number one. Number two, we are uncomfortable committing ourselves to some sort of multilateral security guarantee outside the context of the NATO alliance, which was one of the reasons, as Sam's article pointed out, that the Istanbul Accords did not succeed altogether. But we, despite our reluctance to assume a security commitment to Ukraine, we are continuing to insist that the principle of the open door, the principle that Ukraine can choose its own military alliances, is a sacrosanct principle that we would, violate at our own peril. And I think that that's just an inherently contradictory position for us to be in. And it's also anachronistic. When Cuba decided it wanted to ally with the Soviet Union and, with its own consent, agreed to host Soviet weapons, including nuclear weapons on its territory, the West did not say, well, we don't like this, and yes, it threatened us, but the principle that Cuba can choose its own security arrangements and give host consent to foreign forces is sacrosanct. Not at all. And I think we need to look at this question with a good deal more realism than we have to date.
I have so many questions and we have 1 minute left. So I think I'm going to go out on a lighter note, and I hope these people in the audience are still there, because our first question was from a Jonathan Gold, who said it was from a group of 8th graders watching the panel, which I think is really charming, during lunch. So I don't know if their lunch period is over, but they say, which approach to this conflict makes World War III less likely? How do we prevent what's happening now from escalating into a regional conflict, i.e., World War III? What could we be doing different? Liana,
So I think,
posing it to you
I
first.
think there are two different readings, and I'm pretty sure we will have all those views on the panel. And the one reading is of the war, that if we don't stop this war, we will have some kind of inadvertent escalation or nuclear escalation. We will have NATO troops drawn into, and then we will have a war with Russia, which sort of argues that we should stop this war early and at all costs, and sort of rushing into negotiations. And then there's another take, which would argue that if we solve the war now in the same way we have solved Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, then we will embolden Putin to go further, because there is a line and a pattern historically from 2018, from Russia's invasion in Georgia to Russia's invasion in Ukraine 2014 to the war against Ukraine in 2024. And if you continue this line can continue to, if Vladimir Putin feels emboldened and feels he has gotten the upper hand in Ukraine, to continue this line to Moldova, and then eventually to a Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, who might think it is in his, it's worth trying to provoke NATO, especially if NATO is weakened with a weak US leadership that does not believe in the Article 5 security guarantee. And that certainly is a path that leads us down to a much bigger conflict than Russia, I believe, than the one we have now with Ukraine. And again, the question of leverage is a crucial one. I just don't see, apart from economic sanctions and military leverage, what other kind of leverage we actually have towards Russia that we can exert. And I think it's useful to be clear about that before sort of going into negotiations. But yeah, World War III is, not to speak of China in this picture, but is certainly something where we have to contain Russian imperial ambitions.
Sam?
Well, I think it's fair to say that so long as this war is ongoing, that escalation risks are elevated compared to peacetime. That should be uncontroversial. You can say that undertaking those risks are worth it for the objectives that we're pursuing by, enabling the war to continue. And supporting Ukraine in that. But we have to be honest with ourselves that there are risks, of course. That doesn't mean that, they should therefore determine 100% of your policy, but ignoring the risks would be negligent from the perspective of the United States, at least. I would say one other thing, which is that, we do have some evidence to suggest that if we were, we're using World War III as a synonym for any sort of nuclear weapons use, the closest that we came to that happening in this war was when Russia was potentially on the verge of a catastrophic retreat from the west bank of the Dnipro River in the Kherson region in the fall of 2022. Apparently, if the New York Times is to be believed, again, about the extent to which Russian generals at that time were contemplating the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Now, that also suggests that there's a paradox here about the extent to which we sort of, the challenges of catastrophic success, that Russia losing big might in fact increase escalation risks, given that that was what did it before. And the flip side of that, which is what we've been seeing recently, which I don't think it's a coincidental that at a moment when Ukraine is in a much less advantageous position than it has been since the very first weeks of the war, is the time when you hear European leaders talking about using their own militaries potentially on the ground in Ukraine. So I think that the prospect of one side or the other dramatically, their fortunes on the battlefield dramatically shifting could well lead us down an escalatory path.
George, we got to wrap it up, and I want to give you the last word.
Okay, well, I would agree with Sam. I think John Kennedy, in wrapping up what he regarded as the chief lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis, said, you don't put a nuclear superpower in a position where it has to choose between humiliation and using nuclear weapons. And Sam's exactly right. The closer that either side gets to a clear victory on the battlefield, the more one side faces a choice between humiliation and escalation in some way. And I don't think either side would be quick to resort to nuclear escalation, but they would be, I think, inclined to do some things that will put us on a potential escalatory ladder that will be difficult to control under conditions of deep, deep mistrust on both sides for all of this. And to me, what that says is, okay, if you really are not going to wind up with a clear victory on the other side, if indeed some sort of clear victory raises the dangers of escalation into World War III, then we ought to set our sights on a compromise settlement. That means you're going to have to sit down and talk.
Well, thank you, Liana, George, and Sam, and all of our teenage listeners at middle schools today, as well as this amazing audience, which was huge. Really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to moderating another panel. Please check out Sam and Liana's work in foreign affairs. George has a great piece up with Anatol and Harper's, which is annotated from the brief, and visit Quincy Institute's website for all of our wonderful work. Thank you.